Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Asaf Ramarowski. I am the Executive Director of ASMIA, and it is my pleasure to join you to welcome you all to our latest webinar series. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to talk to our friend and colleague, Professor Jacob Zenn. We'll be discussing his upcoming journal article for ASMIA entitled Boko Haram's Beginnings, Guantanamo Detainee Assessment Revelations on Diaspora Nigerian Jihadists in Saudi Arabia. And this article is forthcoming, and we hope once it's out, we'll be able to circulate this article to all of you. Jacob is currently an adjunct assistant professor at a graduate level course entitled African American Armed Movements at Georgetown University Security Studies Program, and is a senior fellow on African Affairs, and is also the editor of the Terrorism Monitor and Militant Leadership Monitor publications, which is a publication at Jamestown's Foundation in Washington. He is a prolific author and researcher who's spent a great deal of his time dealing with Africa and dealing with Boko Haram. He is a author of the book entitled Unmasking Boko Haram, Exploring Global Jihad in Nigeria, which was published back in 2020. There's obviously a lot going on in Africa that unfortunately does not get enough attention in the media. And this afternoon we'll have the opportunity to really discuss all these issues with Jacob, especially with the upcoming article that will be published shortly. As always, we invite everybody to ask their questions once Jacob is done speaking. He will talk for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to as many questions as we have. Questions will be done via the chat, and please type them in, and then we'll be able to read them and tackle them as they come in. If we do not get to your questions this afternoon, we apologize in advance. Please email us after, and we'll do our best to circle back and get to them, and we'll take it from there. So Jacob, really without further ado, thank you again for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation from ASMIA to hold this panel with you and to present my latest research on Boko Haram's beginnings, Guantanamo Detainee Assessment Revelations on Diaspora Nigerian Jihadists in Saudi Arabia. This will be an article published in a Journal of Middle East and Africa in the coming period. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Larry Simpson, who provided a lot of very close support to me in writing the article, which will make it more digestible for an audience, because as this presentation will illuminate, there are a lot of very intricate details in the assessment that I made, and it was important to write it in a way that could be well understood, and sometimes that's very difficult when you're dealing with a lot of minutiae. So the main topic, or the main source that the article revolved around was the Guantanamo Detainee Assessment and related transcripts of Umran Bakr Mohammed Hausawi, who was a diaspora Nigerian jihadist in Saudi Arabia. So I'll be talking about his case today. But before I do that, I'd like to provide some background on the article and where it is situated in the broader study of Boko Haram. As most people who study Boko Haram will know, there's quite a large debate on whether the group is global or local. And as most people will also realize, the answer is both in many ways. Certain scholars emphasize the local matters, saying that the group was more a product of poverty, insecurity, government abuses, and others, which includes myself, will tend to focus on the global factors that led to Boko Haram's rise, in particular with its founding around 2002 and its origins, which I suggest is in 1994. And in particular, the global school of thought will emphasize that there were Nigerians disaffected with the state, and in particular with the failure of Sharia reforms to provide Northern Nigerians with the type of society that they wanted. They felt that the Sharia reforms did not go far enough, and that the reforms were corrupted, in particular by mixing it with democracy, and the fact that politicians didn't really care about implementing strict Sharia law, and that these Nigerians viewed themselves as part of the global struggle of Al-Qaeda after 9/11, And that's why they formed their Jama, or their group, in 2002. So you can see that there is actually an interaction between global and local factors. But one particular individual always came up in the study of Boko Haram's origins, and this was Muhammad Ali, Abu Abdurrahman Muhammad Ali al-Barnawi, otherwise known as Muhammad Ali. And there had been a debate about him in some articles by Bulama Bukarti on one end and Andre Brugaglia and Alessia Yochi on the other end. And the debate was about whether this founder of the Boko Haram community in 2002, was he an Al-Qaeda operative in Nigeria, or was he an educated Nigerian university student who simply read Al-Qaeda materials and then became influenced to found Boko Haram? And Brigaglia and Yochi said he was actually an Al-Qaeda operative, and the sources point to that. And so the Boko Haram founder was actually an Al-Qaeda operative. So when we look at Boko Haram's founding, we need to situate the group in the context of Boko Haram being part of the global movement of Al-Qaeda, and that global factors animated the movement. The other perspective from Bukarti was that, yes, there was influence from Al-Qaeda, but we need to situate Ali in a much more local context, since he was not an Al-Qaeda operative. So originally what I wanted to do is just collect all of the sources about Muhammad Ali and say, okay, who was he based on the sources? And I had around 20 sources, and this included people who claimed to know him to various degrees, Al-Qaeda articles about the group's history in Nigeria that mentioned him, intelligence reports that mentioned him, Nigerian scholars who heard things about him, think tank reports that involved interviews of people who knew him. And of course, one can always debate the accuracy of all different types of sources. So nothing's going to be perfect. But I thought that the sources pointed towards Ali being more on the Al-Qaeda operative spectrum. But while conducting that research, I also noticed that even though I had written a book about Boko Haram in 2020, there were still sources about the group's origins that had been under our noses for years that people were still discovering. For example, Brigaglia and Yochi found from leaked State Department cables information about US intelligence meeting with Nigerian intelligence even before 9/11 about Algerian GSPC operatives in Nigeria as early as 1994. And I thought, wow, I researched the whole book. I tried to find every source about the group, and there's still sources out there that we haven't found. So I tried to see if there's more about Muhammad Ali that we could find. I searched everywhere, think tank reports, leaked State Department cables. But what I came up on was actually a Guantanamo detainee transcript, not of Muhammad Ali, but that mentioned someone named Ibrahim Haroun. Without getting into too much detail, Ibrahim Haroun was a diaspora Nigerian jihadist in Saudi Arabia who was sent by Al-Qaeda's third in command at that time from Pakistan to Nigeria. And I argued from my sources that he interacted with Muhammad Ali's cell at the time in 2003, which again points to Ali being an Al-Qaeda operative. But actually, the source that I found that mentioned Ibrahim Haroun was the Guantanamo detainee transcript of Umran Bakr Muhammad Hausawi. And in fact, that was one of several Hausawi Guantanamo detainee transcripts that in all of the literature on Boko Haram for the past 15 years has just not been studied. No one has looked into Hausawi. That means Hausa Nigerians in Saudi Arabia who joined Al-Qaeda. And so this brought me to the Guantanamo detainee transcript Umran Bakr Muhammad Hausawi. And let me tell you some of the things that I found in that detainee transcript and how this one source really compelled me to look beyond just Muhammad Ali's background and look deeper into Boko Haram's origins. So as I mentioned, Umran, I'll call him Umran, his transcript mentioned the following. So when he was brought to Guantanamo, and I'll talk about how he got there in a second, the US interrogators interrogated Umran. And the transcript noted that the Saudi Mabahith, which is like the secret police, they already knew about Umran when he arrived to Guantanamo in 2002. And the Saudis had told the US interrogators that an individual named Ibrahim Haroun, who was a diaspora Nigerian jihadist who grew up in Saudi Arabia and joined Al-Qaeda and was deployed to Nigeria in 2003 and arrested in Libya in 2005, he had told the Saudis that he knew Umran, he knew Umran's brother Umar, and he knew their other brother Fahd, and he knew their other brothers. And at least Umar and Fahd had joined Al-Qaeda in 1994, which is notable because I had found a number of other sources, which are included in a table in the article that I'm publishing, that talks about all the sources that detail Nigerian jihadism's origins in 1994. So this Ibrahim Harun figure, who was deployed by Al-Qaeda to Nigeria in 2003, he knew Umar and Umran from their time in Saudi Arabia. He knew that Umran's brothers joined Al-Qaeda in 1994, and the CIA, the U.S. interrogation of Umran also revealed that Mabahith had told the U.S. interrogators that bin Laden had a Yemeni assistant, who I'll get to in a moment, who had asked Umar to come to meet bin Laden before 9/11, and then bin Laden told Umar to go to Nigeria and to recruit members to Al-Qaeda, again, before 9/11. And that at that time, Umran was already in Nigeria, and then Umar recruited Umran to Al-Qaeda, and then Umran ended up going to Afghanistan after 9/11, where he got injured and was taken to a hospital in Pakistan, where the Saudi ambassador met him and then gave him to the US. And so these are the main details of the transcript. And so what this establishes, and I'll get to what I extrapolate from it in more detail in the next slide, is that there was actually an Al-Qaeda network that's larger than we had previously believed in Nigeria before 9/11. Previously, at least in all of my work in my book, Unmasking Boko Haram, I had known about this Ibrahim Harun fellow. But it was always sort of mysterious what he did in Nigeria, because we knew he was sent to Nigeria and by Al-Qaeda in 2003, actually. But we didn't really know who he interacted with or what Al-Qaeda infrastructure was already there. Was he the first Al-Qaeda member? But there are two sources that link him to this individual named Yusuf Ahmed, who also was a diaspora Nigerian jihadist in Saudi Arabia, who arrived in Nigeria in 2002. And Yusuf Ahmed was considered to be a right-hand man of Muhammad Ali. So what this was pointing to me, even before the Umran detainee transcript, was that Muhammad Ali was part of the Al-Qaeda cell or infrastructure in Nigeria when he founded Boko Haram in 2002 and established what was a rural encampment in Kanama Yobe State of mostly local fighters, we can say, or mostly local university students. So it was sort of a mix of Ali being part of this Al-Qaeda cell and then him recruiting local university students to form what became the nuclei of Boko Haram in 2002, which has evolved into the much larger movement today. So here are my three extrapolations from this source, which are detailed in the article in a longer way than I can do here. So this Yemeni who invited Umran's brother, from Saudi Arabia to meet bin Laden in Afghanistan before 9/11 was Abu Muhammad al-Yemeni. There are already a number of sources that put him in Nigeria before 9/11, and that put him as a close bin Laden confidant since the time in Sudan in the 90s. So the Yemeni must be Abu Muhammad al-Yemeni. He brought Umar to meet bin Laden in Afghanistan before 9/11. Bin Laden told Umar to go to Nigeria to recruit Nigerians to Al-Qaeda. And because Umar went there before 9/11, and because Muhammad al-Yemeni went there, according to various sources, before 9/11, I assume, this is my extrapolation, that they traveled together on a mission to Nigeria, as well as Niger for al-Yemeni and Mali, and even Algeria for al-Yemeni. He did a whole crisscross across West Africa. And they went there to recruit Nigerians to Al-Qaeda. Now, we don't have many details about what happened to them in Nigeria, who they met with, since the transcript is limited. But I extrapolate that they were establishing the first Al-Qaeda cell, the first Al-Qaeda network in Nigeria, and that Muhammad Ali became part of that network. Now, there's an Al-Qaeda source from this faction called Ansaru in Nigeria, which is now much smaller because it's been destroyed by the more ruthless ISIS faction and the Abu Bakr Shekau faction. But in this Ansaru memoir, they talk about Muhammad Ali receiving funding from Al-Qaeda. Now, one can criticize the source and say, oh, this is just Al-Qaeda bragging about funding this individual named Muhammad Ali, but it didn't really happen. But when Al-Qaeda writes these historical memoirs, they're usually generally accurate. And I don't think that Al-Qaeda is necessarily lying about the funding that went to Ali, which Al-Qaeda claimed in that memoir, or Ansarud claimed in that memoir, came from the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia or Yemen. And there are other sources which are detailed in the article, which mention an Algerian GSPC member, the GSPC being the predecessor of AQIM, who funded Nigerian Salafis, in particular from offshoot groups. And this happened between 1994 and 2003. And the sources indicate that this Algerian named Hassan Alane, he was also recruiting Nigerians from abroad to come back to Nigeria to begin this jihadi program. So based on the sources evaluated in the article and what this transcript reveals, I think it's actually very likely that al-Yemeni, who himself, according to other documents found by the United States and Iraq, he was actually funding the GSPC. So I extrapolate that it's likely that al-Yemeni was the individual connected to the individuals in the Arabian Peninsula who provided funding to the GSPC in Nigeria, who then funded offshoot Salafi groups in Nigeria, which would have included Ali, or in particular his mentor. Now, the funding did not necessarily get to Ali because Al-Qaeda says it was stolen from him by his mentor, who abandoned the jihadi project because he got scared and actually fled to Saudi Arabia. So I'm not saying that the funding helped a lot, but it points to Ali being part of this network when he founded Boko Haram. And I'll talk about why that mentor probably fled Nigeria with that money after 9/11 in a moment. It gets to one of the big points of the article, which is about the role of counterintelligence in Boko Haram's, or the role of intelligence operations in Boko Haram's founding. Lastly, also what you see is Muhammad Ali. If you ask a number of individuals familiar with his background, they'll point to him training or traveling to Sudan sometime in the 90s, becoming influenced by Al-Qaeda in Sudan in the 90s. Various people who knew him point to him being in Saudi Arabia as a child, or even when he was older, or returning to Saudi Arabia when he got older because his father had business there. So he had his own ties to Saudi Arabia and Sudan. The individual who links him to Ibrahim Harun, with Yusuf Ahmed, also grew up in Saudi Arabia, according to early reporting about him. Ibrahim Harun grew up in Saudi Arabia. Umran and Umar, of course, grew up in Saudi Arabia. And there are some other figures, such as Khalid al-Barnawi, who's the founder of Ansarud, who has a history in Saudi Arabia, and other individuals mentioned in the article who played an important role in Boko Haram, who grew up in Saudi Arabia. And then if you look at the Guantanamo detainee transcripts, you'll find other Hausawis who grew up in Saudi Arabia and joined Al-Qaeda, but might not have been tied to Boko Haram, even though the US interrogators thought that might be the case. And that includes Mustafa al-Hawsawi and Musa al-Hawsawi, and then even one of the funders of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan was suggested by the interrogators to have had the name al-Barnawi as well, meaning from Borno. So this actually indicates something to me that, as most people who study jihadism will know, the movement really started in the Middle East in the 1990s. And it makes sense that Nigerians who would have been in Saudi Arabia at the time and who would have been involved in the theological institutes, such as Umar and Umran, because in the transcripts it reveals that they studied at Islamic institutes and worked for Islamic charities. It wouldn't have been strange for Nigerian diaspora individuals to have joined Al-Qaeda just as other Saudis did. They, after all, were growing up in Saudi Arabia. But because of their tie to Nigeria, it does seem that they were found to be particularly useful to expand Al-Qaeda's project to their homeland, where they knew the local language and they had some contact. And I think that's actually an important factor in Boko Haram's origins that has also been illuminated by other sources besides these transcripts, including, for example, Vincent Fauché, a scholar in France, his recent interviews of Boko Haram members. And this is also detailed in the tables presented in the online version of the article that will come out. So I want to share some concluding thoughts. One, when we look at Boko Haram's trajectory and why it was founded when it was, and then when we look at the fact that today it's very immersed in ISIS, the group's leadership, when you listen to their internal or public audios, they talk about ISIS, they talk about their loyalty to the Caliph, they talk about their communications with the Caliph. They've obviously issued a number of videos with hundreds of members pledging loyalty to the Caliph. The recent factional dispute in which the ISIS faction killed the rival Abu Bakr Shekau faction also involved some interaction with ISIS, who also wanted Shekau killed because Shekau was disloyal to the caliphate. So the idea that Boko Haram has become so integrated with ISIS, at least at the leadership level, is actually very consistent with the origins of the group. When Boko Haram began becoming loyal to ISIS around 2013, 2014, it was considered that this was a ploy and the group was really a locally motivated movement, and that they were just using ISIS to garner support. But actually, I think the fact that they joined ISIS is very consistent with their early trajectory, the leader Mohammed Yusuf from 2004 to 2009, with his declarations about Al-Qaeda, and the group's alliance with Al-Qaeda in the 2009 to 2012 period, and then joining ISIS. So this has been a consistent trajectory. And I do think it points to what Brigaglia argued was, global factors animating the group to rise up. And I would also point out that it wasn't like Nigerian Salafis were not interested in jihadism in the 1990s. And various audio materials have come out indicating Nigerian Salafis had interest in this jihadi movement and Al-Qaeda in the 1990s and even after 9/11. But actually what happened was those Nigerians who were not really tied to Al-Qaeda, even though what you might call hardcore Salafis, they did not fight against the Nigerian state. They ended up coming to an accommodation with it, even if Sharia was imperfect. They came to an accommodation with democracy. They came to an accommodation with Christians. They came to an accommodation with westernization. But why did Boko Haram not? Why did the Salafis in Boko Haram not do that? And I think it was because they were not just animated by Al-Qaeda, but they were organically linked to the movement from the beginning. And that explains why Boko Haram is so anomalous and why you actually don't see various other jihadi movements emerge, even from the Salafi community that has, if anything, so far deviated from jihadism that they're probably they have been the number one enemies of Boko Haram for that deviation. A second concluding thought I have is about intelligence and counterintelligence and impact. One of the points that comes out from the transcript of Umran is the role of Mabahith, the Saudis, in observing what was happening in Nigeria. Other sources, including leaked State Department cables, point to the United States, ambassadors, intelligence agencies, watching what was going on in Nigeria before 9/11. You also have Algerian intelligence tracking Algerians going to Nigeria before 9/11. So it really hasn't been appreciated the extent to which those Nigerians who were linked to Al-Qaeda early on, including Umran, including Ibrahim Harun, who got captured in Libya in 2005, very likely because of tips from US intelligence or Saudi intelligence. And all these Nigerians involved in the early network, they all got decimated. Why? Because I think those Nigerians, diaspora Nigerians involved in the early Al-Qaeda cells, including Muhammad Ali, who was killed, and Yusuf Ahmed, who was killed, they were all being tracked in one way or another. So why did Boko Haram rise up in 2003? I think a very plausible hypothesis why they waged war against Nigeria in 2003 when they were still a very small group and they got crushed was because they felt an intelligence dragnet on them. And that if they were going to wait any longer, they would all be captured. So they thought, this is our last chance, let's fight. And they did get demolished in 2003. And it's important to note that in mid-2003, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula attacked Saudi Arabia. And at that point, the kingdom became quite resolute against jihadism and against interacting with them. So why did Boko Haram fight in late 2003 before the group was really strong enough to? Probably because intelligence was getting to the group and they felt this is our last chance to fight. But it's notable that despite getting clobbered in late 2003 by the Nigerian security forces, the group did revive. And again, I think you need to attribute some global factors to this because members did retreat to the Sahel. And then they ended up coming back to join the movement in 2004 under Muhammad Yusuf, who himself was not very much linked to Al-Qaeda, but was trying to create an organic local movement, which he did from 2004 to 2009. Although he drew inspiration from Al-Qaeda, he was very successful in making Boko Haram actually into a mass movement by staying above ground. And although he had some links to the Nigerians who trained with Al-Qaeda, he mostly cultivated a mass following through preaching. And it's important to note, the Nigerian security forces also clobbered him in 2009 and killed him and his followers. And he also started a rebellion against the state in June 2009. Partly because I think he also felt that the dragnet was closing in on him. He was going to be arrested. He had been arrested already. And he also launched this quick rebellion and got crushed. And I think that's partly because he also felt a dragnet closing in on him and he had no room to operate. But again, the movement came back after being crushed in 2009 and emerged in 2010. Again, as the bin Laden documents that were found in his compound reveal, Abu Bakr Shekau, who took over the leadership in 2010, again sent members to the Sahel to get specialized training, and they came back to Nigeria in 2010 and launched a spree of suicide attacks that was completely unprecedented for Nigeria in 2010. And it's led to the widespread insurgency we see today in northeastern Nigeria and even parts of the northwest. So this leads to another point about just historiology of Boko Haram. One thing that I find interesting is that most people who study Boko Haram today were studying Nigeria or studying jihadism or studying African affairs in 2009 when Muhammad Yusuf was crushed and the movement began to become big. And so this was like a very living history for the entire community of people who study Boko Haram. But what's interesting is there's a new generation of scholars and students who are beginning to study Boko Haram who probably were too young to remember the events of 2009. So I think the way that Boko Haram studies may very well change in the future years because the events of 2009 to a new generation is a history and it's something they didn't live with. So they're going to rely a lot more on the sources that I guess you could say the previous generation, which I think I'm a part of, to provide them, the sources so they can continue to study the group and come up with better solutions and understandings of it. I also think that for those who study Boko Haram, it's important at this point to break up the study into phases. I date the origin to 1994 based on sources included in Umran's transcript and other sources mentioned in the article. And so when people talk about Boko Haram funding or Boko Haram recruitment or Boko Haram ideology, it's very hard to do that in the present when the ideology today and the way the movement is today is very much different than it was in 2010. You can't talk about the Muhammad Yusuf era before 2009 and then talk about the era today. The ideology has changed. The way the movement operates has changed. It's now a full-fledged militant movement with sophisticated tactics, including drones. It's no longer a preaching group, nor is it a small community led by Muhammad Ali like it was in 2003. So all of these questions about funding, ideology, and recruitment really need to be broken up into historical phases now and not looked at monolithically as if the group has always had the same ideology and doctrines. And of course, we have multiple factions today, which makes that study even more different. In terms of future research, there's probably sources out there. FOIA means Freedom of Information Act. The US government obviously has some sources related to, for example, Ibrahim Harun that could shed light on the early history of Boko Haram, but they're not sharing them through FOIA requests. I'm sure Saudi Mabahith has other sources on some of these individuals, but they're obviously not going to easily share them. But sources to better understand the origins of the movement are out there. I think they'll be very hard to find now, but I do think hardworking researchers might be able to try to locate them either through working with government institutions or continuing to pour through memoirs of some jihadists. And it's very hard to find the sources because sometimes it just comes up through serendipity. But if you put yourself out there to try to collect all these sources, it's possible you'll find one, and that it can completely influence the understanding of the movement, and that will ultimately, hopefully, help us think about solutions to prevent future such movements and to deal with the current movement that is affecting Nigeria today. So that's my final thought, and I'd love to take part in Q&A now.
Terrific. Thank you, Professor Zenn. So we have probably more questions in the queue here than we have time to answer, but we will do our best. So the first question comes from Professor Joe Spurl, and he asks, how important is the historical example of Usman Dan Fodio to contemporary jihadists in Nigeria?
The short answer is not very much today. He's not mentioned often, and that might be because Boko Haram leaders are mostly Kanuri whereas Danfodio had antagonism with Kanouris historically. And the doctrines of Danfodio are slightly different than the current leaders. It's also possible that the current leaders are not that educated and astute, and that they're not very familiar with his works, so they ignore them. However, there was a period where Muhammad Yusuf, before 2009, connected his movement to a resuscitation of Danfodio's jihad. And there was a period before Boko Haram joined ISIS that they connected joining the caliphate of ISIS to Danfodio's jihad. So he has come up from time to time, but the narratives involving him are not that great. If anything, the Ansuru faction, which is not really led by Kanouris, but is led by Hausas or Fulanis in particular, they tend to draw on him more, and that's the Al-Qaeda faction, but they're much smaller. They're based in northwest Nigeria, and they haven't succeeded in rivaling the ISIS faction, despite that they have a more civilian-centric orientation.
Terrific. Thank you. Okay, our next question here is from Professor William Miles at Northeastern University. He writes, the most famous, or rather infamous, Nigerian diaspora jihadist with Yemeni al-Qaeda contacts is Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalab, the so-called underwear bomber, who attempted a suicide bombing on a flight about to land in Detroit in 2009. Have you come across references to him in your research on this particular network?
That's a great question, because the type of networks he had might suggest that he would have been associated with Boko Haram. And I did research into him as much as I could to see if he was involved in these networks before 2009. Some of the documents, like court documents and interrogations of him, revealed he was not very familiar with Boko Haram when he was in Yemen. In that period, around 2009. And however, when you look at his radicalization process, which I believe was in the early 2000s in around Kaduna, some of the interrogations talk about him being influenced by certain preachers at certain mosques, but I don't think the names are given in the documents. That being said, it would be interesting to know which preachers were the ones that influenced him to turn toward a jihadi path in the early 2000s. And that might connect him with some of the early influences of Boko Haram. That being said, Abdul Muttalib is mostly a unique case that is separate from Boko Haram.
Thank you. Okay, our next question here that I'll read is from Professor Nathan DeVere from the University of Utah, and he writes, I realize that this question is about the future, not the beginnings of Boko Haram, but would you be able to say a few words about the implications of Burkina Faso's recent regime change and the implications of that change concerning the country's ability to fight Boko Haram's activities in the region?
Well, what I could say about that is that there's a lot of political turmoil in the Sahelian states right now. And the insurgency there, which is led mostly by the Al-Qaeda affiliated faction known by the acronym JNIM, it's really metastasizing there. It's, if anything, perhaps growing. You also have an ISIS faction in the Sahel. And the continued political turmoil, political instability, the issues with France withdrawing from Mali, the Russian Wagner group coming in, it really doesn't bode well for forming a comprehensive strategy to deal with the insurgency in the Sahel. And I don't know if that's directly linked to Boko Haram, but it does mean that with continued insurgencies in the Sahel, and Boko Haram obviously remaining very strong in northeastern Nigeria, and Boko Haram trying to revive itself in northwestern Nigeria, where Ansuru already is, points to a possible linking of movements in the Sahel and northwestern Nigeria. And it really, but more broadly, it just points to the fact that there's really no comprehensive institution or political willpower to end these insurgent movements. And if anything, the coup in West African states indicates that the insurgencies will only continue to metastasize or possibly even spread to other countries.
Thank you. Okay, this next question is from Pierre Langono. Did you think that all Salafists involved with Boko Haram originated from Arabia? How about anthropology and politics of violence in the northeast of Nigeria and in the Lake Chad borders?
So I think that a lot of the Salafists in Nigeria who were influential among the early members of the group around 2003 themselves were very much influenced from Saudi Arabia and had likely studied there or read the books of Saudi scholars. And I don't think many people question that. But what this article is intending to contribute is that there was actually an Al Qaeda infrastructure in Nigeria before 2003, comprised of diaspora Nigerians in Saudi Arabia, probably because they were exposed to actual jihadist networks before 9/11 and were able to bring that to their homeland more effectively than, say, an Egyptian jihadist, for example. So I was talking more about human ties in my article. And it is important to note, though, that the Saudi state, the kingdom, by 2003 really turned against the jihadist wave, and it certainly is against the jihadist wave today. And that most of the Nigerian Salafist scholars that had been influenced by Saudi Arabia ended up coming to an accommodation with the Nigerian state and Christians and westernization and democracy, whereas Boko Haram has not. So Boko Haram has, if anything, become more influenced by, say, ISIS theology than, say, Saudi theology.
Okay. This question is from Frederick Kumalalo. Bearing in mind that northeastern Nigeria did experience religious uprisings in 1984 and 1992, did Al Qaeda benefit from any extent structure when it sent its agent to Nigeria? The military elements' earlier movements were suppressed, but what about the structures, if any? Was Boko Haram a brand new movement or a new iteration of an earlier structure?
That's an interesting question because there was the Maitatsine movement in northeastern Nigeria in the 1980s, and in some way it resembled Boko Haram by being, anti-Westernization and by recruiting from among the urban poor and disaffected people. And if you look at Muhammad Yusuf's own family, him being the group leader from 2004 to 2009, you can find some traces of Maitatsine influence among some of his uncles. So it's very possible you have some type of connection there. But Maitatsine was basically considered heretical because of his belief in amulets. Boko Haram was much more conventional Salafi when it formed. It just took a jihadi path, which most Salafis have rejected. And then it's also important to note in the context of these global local debates that that Maitatsine was crushed again and again and again in the 1980s, and it basically doesn't exist anymore. And Nigeria, I think, thought then that they could just crush Boko Haram too, and they tried to multiple times. But something about Boko Haram is different than Maitatsine. It is coming back again and again and harder. And I think that is partly attributed to the fact that, one, it had human connections to other jihadists in the Sahel, if not in Somalia and elsewhere, to help the group revive. And its ideology was stronger because it wasn't rooted in this unique, eccentric Maitatsine ideology, but the ideology was able to find fertile ground because it had connections to the ideology that Al Qaeda has been developing over the years, which itself is an offshoot of mainstream Salafism.
Great. Okay, this is a question from Carl Goldberg. He asks, which verses from the Quran and the Sunnah does Boko Haram cite in order to justify their movement?
I would point to the book Boko Haram Reader by Abdul Basit Kasim and Michael Nwangfa because they detail dozens and dozens of Boko Haram speeches and writings that detail their religious influences. But if you want to look at their religious influences, you'll look at issues related to jihad, the caliphate, kufar, infidelity, apostasy, and Sharia. I mean, those are the main issues that they focus on religiously, in addition to the earlier phases of the group, which had political grievances of the Nigerian state. Now the group does not talk about grievances so much against the Nigerian state or Nigerian politics or even Nigerian Salafis, which is a reason why I point to studying the group in phases. The group used to be interested in all these local Nigerian issues. They've really deviated from that, and now they focus, I think, more on issues that are of concern to ISIS generally than to Nigerian issues. It's part of the group's evolution.
Okay, Steve Onyewu asks, does the kidnap of the Chibok girls support the global or local origins of Boko Haram? Why are the girls still being held? And what message is Boko Haram sending by continuously holding the girls captive?
That's an interesting question. The operation itself was mostly local in origin. In fact, Shekau rejected the mainstream jihadi ideology by enslaving not only the mostly Christian girls in Chibok, but also the Muslim girls in Chibok. That operation was not ideologically welcomed by at least Al Qaeda. And ISIS had welcomed the kidnapping of the Christians, but not of the Muslim girls. But Boko Haram, led by Shekau, thought that the Muslim girls were also infidels because they were receiving Western education. And the whole way that the kidnapping played out was among the reasons why ISIS ended up kicking Shekau out of being the ISIS leader for Nigeria. And then he formed his own faction again, known as the Shekau faction. And then Muhammad Yusuf's son ended up becoming the leader of the ISIS faction. So although it was mostly a local operation in nature, the ramifications went up to the ISIS level in Syria and Iraq, which made them want to depose Shekau. And then the deposing of Shekau led to the factional disputes that affect the nature of the movement today. And I think that's my main commentary on Chibok.
Okay. Yeah, we had a couple of questions about the kidnapped girls. Do you want me to throw out the rest of them to you?
Sure, go ahead and I'll touch on what I can.
Okay. So this is a question from Dr. Mary Nyangwesu from East Carolina University, and she writes, it's interesting to see the links of Boko Haram to Al Qaeda and ISIS, to note the change in ideology. Initially, Boko Haram seemed to focus on non-Western education. The abduction of girls from school seemed to be key in their ideology. What rationale do they offer for collaborating with Al Qaeda and ISIS? Also, is it fair to say all jihadist movements seem to unite against Western ideology?
Yes, so it's important to note that Boko Haram ended up engaging in a negotiation with local facilitators, and they released around 100 of the Chibok girls. Several dozen died in captivity, either of Air Force strikes that inadvertently killed them, or snake bites, or hunger, or other factors, disease. And then there's still dozens with Boko Haram that have been essentially forcibly married or forcibly converted to Islam and want to stay with Boko Haram. So there's still actually a lot of Chibok girls with Boko Haram who did not want to leave. And in fact, that happens sometimes. Another Nigerian youth corps Christian who got captured by Boko Haram named Abraham Amuta, he also chose to stay with the group after becoming indoctrinated into their ideology. So sometimes this type of Stockholm syndrome happens. So it's important to note there are actually Chibok girls alive with Boko Haram today. The group justifies its alliance with Al Qaeda and ISIS basically on the belief that ISIS is a legitimate caliphate. It meets the Islamic credentials to be a caliphate, and the Islamic State Caliph meets the credentials to be a caliph, and that all Muslims must swear by the caliph after he emerges in the world, and therefore Boko Haram today says that's why it's part of the caliphate. Although and the reason why you don't see the ISIS faction, which is the larger faction today, engaging in slavery like the Shekau faction did, is because ISIS is against it. So that's one reason that they don't do it, at least to Muslims. They have enslaved certain Christian girls that refuse to convert to Islam, however.
Okay. Mamadou asks, ISIS is not what it used to be. Nonetheless, it still exists. Do you think the weakening of ISIS has an effect on Boko Haram today? Can you give some examples?
It would seem to be a reasonable assumption that because ISIS doesn't control territory like it used to in Iraq and Syria, and because its caliph just got killed a few weeks ago, and then al-Baghdadi got killed in 2019, that ISIS would lose attraction from its provinces, as they call them. But there's really no indication at all from the ISIS faction in Nigeria, known as Islamic State in West Africa Province, or Boko Haram, that they're doubting ISIS. None of their internal communications point to questioning whether the caliphate is legitimate or questioning being members of the caliphate due to al-Baghdadi's death. There haven't been any factional feuds as a result of the fall of the caliphate in Iraq and Syria. If anything, from their statements, they're more motivated because of the struggles of their brothers in Iraq and Syria to fight harder. And ISIS in Iraq and Syria really needs the ISIS faction in Nigeria because it's their most active province in the world in terms of attacks and sophistication and control of territory. So they really need to show that ISIS controls territory, in this case in Nigeria, to their global audience to show that the caliphate still has a territory, because that's an important part of it. So the real answer is, despite the struggles of ISIS, it's shown little effect on the commitment of the ISIS provinces around the world to that caliphate project.
Okay. There's a question here about the role of Nigeria's politicians. What's the role of Nigerians politicians in the formation of Boko Haram?
So here's a good example of a case where you want to break Boko Haram history into phases. So in the, say, 2005 to 2009 period, politicians, local politicians, high-level politicians may very well have affiliated with the movement, or their cousins or brothers may have been part of the movement, or even their sisters may have married members of the movement. They may have funded the movement. They may have funded it because they believed in the ideology of the movement at the time, particularly its demand for stronger Sharia. They may have funded it because they wanted the movement to like them, and that could help them possibly in elections or for other types of political power plays. And so there were connections in that pre-2009 period. After the 2009 period, when the group really started fighting the insurgency, and it became much more wild under the leadership of Shekau than anyone could imagine, you saw some politicians likely talking to the group members, not necessarily supporting it, but trying to negotiate. And some politicians maybe were implicated in supporting the group because they were negotiating. There may also have been some politicians in Cameroon that were trying to provide the group weapons simply as a way to make money, or because they were part of these black market weapons channels. But I think since 2012, that's really dissipated, and you're very unlikely to see politicians interacting or supporting the movement today.
Okay, here's an interesting one, but from Bashir Mundi. He asks if you can comment on reports in the Nigerian media and by de-radicalization on the ground about captured Boko Haram fighters and associates who turned out to be non-Muslim Nigerians. What could have been the motives of such individuals in fighting with Boko Haram?
I think that's an interesting question, and it's one that needs further research, not only from people who study Boko Haram, but also, say, psychology, or even the field of de-radicalization. Because it doesn't surprise me anymore that there are people who were originally Christian who would have been captured by the group, and something happened to them while in the group that they legitimately want to stay with it. I think, for example, many of the Chibok girls that are with the group now, they legitimately want to stay with the group. They want to stay with their husbands in the group, even if they were forcibly married. They obviously have children in the group. And then I mentioned the case of Abraham Amuta. He wasn't even kidnapped for long before he was featured in a Boko Haram video and recently killed while being a Boko Haram fighter. So there are individuals who are captured by Boko Haram, who are Christians, and in that even brief period with them, they want to stay in the movement. And part of it might be that whatever you say about jihadis, they die frequently. They're giving their life for a cause. Their lives probably have a lot of meaning. Their lives are probably somewhat adventurous to wage combat. And I wouldn't be surprised if some people find deep meaning in being part of this jihadist cause. But I can't really answer that question well, other than to note that the fact that there are Christians or people who are born Christian who are found in Boko Haram and then join de-radicalization programs after they're captured is not surprising to me. Of course, by the time that they're captured, they're no longer Christian, I'm sure. The group would not allow anyone to be Christian, but they've converted to Islam and somehow become enamored by the group's ideology and mission.
Okay, so we have two questions here that are very similar, so I'm going to try to combine them. The questions are basically asking you if you could explain the correlation or the link between Boko Haram and ISWAP, ISWAP, and if your research, what your research has shown you about a link between the two.
So it's very important to understand that Boko Haram, meaning Western education is sinful, is a name that was given to Boko Haram in the mid 2000s by rival Salafis who didn't support the group and who wanted to essentially mock the group for believing that Western education is sinful. And it's never been the group's name, but it's a name that outsiders use to refer to the movement. The movement itself comprises Islamic State in West Africa Province, or ISWAP. This is the largest faction that's very active in northeastern Nigeria. Then there's another faction called the Abu Bakr Shekau faction that was kicked out of ISIS, ISWAP being loyal to ISIS. The Shekau faction was kicked out of ISWAP because it wasn't following the directives of ISIS itself in Iraq and Syria. And the Shekau faction is now struggling because ISWAP killed Shekau and his commanders around him. And some of Shekau's followers are now joining ISWAP and repenting in a way. And ISWAP is accepting them. And then there's a third faction called Ansaru, or supporters of Muslims in Black Africa. That's their long name. And they're the Al-Qaeda loyal faction. They're in northwestern Nigeria. And it's important to note that the article that will be published in a Journal of Middle East and Africa, it discusses in the beginning the differences between the different factions that comprise what we know of as Boko Haram. And it even connects the three different factions to Muhammad Ali and discusses how they relate to the origins of the movement in different ways.
Okay, there's a question here. It says the recently designated terror group in Nigeria referred to as bandits. Some have suggested that rather than the Saudis, Iran has been prominent in their formation. Do you consider this group as jihadist? And if so, what prominent global terror groups are they aligned to?
So if we talk about Boko Haram in phases again, you can actually point to some interesting Iranian influences in really the 1980s. This is before Boko Haram movement began, in terms of the idea of an Islamic revolution in Nigeria that led to a certain form of radicalism, which may have fed into Boko Haram in some ways, because I think it's very credible that Muhammad Yusuf, who led the group from 2004, he had flirted with the Shia movements in Nigeria before becoming a Sunni officially in 1995, and then forming Boko Haram later with Muhammad Ali as a partner. But today, I don't think there's Iranian funding of the bandits or Boko Haram or anything like that. What's more interesting to look at is that it's very clear that the Ansaru, Al-Qaeda loyal faction, ISWAP to an extent, and the Shekau faction are all looking to get involved in northwestern Nigeria, where banditry is rampant. And they're trying to link with the bandits to provide a sort of ideological motive for the bandits and a state caliphate building project for the bandits. It seems like the integration is not that strong right now, but there are certainly efforts underway for the jihadis to link with the bandits more formally. And that's something that I think researchers, scholars, practitioners, government officials, military people, civil society really needs to continue watching, because it can affect the dynamics of the security situation in northwestern Nigeria.
Okay, they're coming fast and furious. All right. We have a question here. Mohammed Yusuf is one of the greatest contributors to the rise of Boko Haram, not only after 2003 when he took over, but even before. Please, can you elaborate on the role he played?
So Muhammad Yusuf's role in Boko Haram before 2003 is discussed in the article that will be published. And it's also discussed in my book, Unmasking Boko Haram. And his history is discussed in other books about Boko Haram, such as Thurston's book on the subject, or the Qasim and Nwanka book on the subject. And so it's probably too much to detail here. But I think for the purpose of this discussion, what's important to note is that I argue Muhammad Ali was involved in the Al-Qaeda infrastructure in Nigeria. But because he wasn't that well grounded in the local dynamics, because I consider him more of a, say, global-oriented figure, Muhammad Yusuf, in contrast, was a very local-oriented figure, despite being influenced by Al-Qaeda. So what made Boko Haram work in around 2002, 2003, was the linking of a sort of Al-Qaeda infrastructure figure like Muhammad Ali with a Borno and Yobe-based figure like Muhammad Yusuf, who had a lot of local roots. So when they co-led Boko Haram, then known as the Nigerian Taliban in 2002, 2003, they had enough of that global exposure via Ali and the local exposure via Yusuf. And that actually formed an effective embryo of the movement that would later grow and become the Boko Haram that we know today.
I think this will be our last question. It's if Muhammad Ali was so instrumental and an important link to origins of Boko Haram, how come he is rarely referred to by later incarnations of the movement? Did his relevance end with his death? And what does the waning of Al-Qaeda's influence in the post-Daesh merger with Boko Haram say about its actual influence and stranglehold on the group's origins as a whole?
I think that's a really great question that fits very well with the topic of the discussion today. And it's a question that I touch on in the very conclusion of the article, which looks at how do the various factions of the Boko Haram movement look at Muhammad Ali today. And one of the interesting points is that the Shekau faction basically never mentions him, as if he never existed. The ISIS faction only mentions him negatively, and that's likely because he came into conflict with Muhammad Yusuf, finding that Muhammad Yusuf wasn't really jihadi enough or wasn't willing to call takfir on people enough. And Muhammad Yusuf's lineage has existed in the ISIS faction because Yusuf's son became the leader until he died recently in combat with the security forces. But yet it's the Al-Qaeda faction, which if anything recalls him positively. And that's interesting because Muhammad Ali ended up becoming more ideologically extreme than Al-Qaeda before his death. But at the same time, I do argue in the article that he was essentially part of the Al-Qaeda infrastructure. So it would not be surprising to me that Al-Qaeda still claims him and remembers him well, at least in that Ansarud memoir of him. So if anything, it seems like Ali's lineage is to Ansarud. But if I touch on one broader theme of this talk is that Boko Haram has evolved a lot. The group exists in phases. And even if you look at a central figure like Muhammad Yusuf, who is most people's starting point for the study of Boko Haram, even though I traced the starting point to Muhammad Ali in 1994, even Muhammad Yusuf is not mentioned at all, basically, in any literature or speeches by any of the factions today. At least if he is mentioned, it's very rare. So it's important to note for, say, people who study Boko Haram today and begin to study today, the new generation, if you will, that when they look at most of the books about Boko Haram, they'll see a lot of discussion about Muhammad Yusuf. But the question is, does a figure like Muhammad Yusuf, is a figure like Muhammad Yusuf, who was so central 10 or 15 years ago, is he really that central to the movement today? Or has the movement moved on now that it's a completely militant-oriented movement, whereas under Yusuf, it was a mostly preaching-oriented movement?
We will bring this webinar to a close. We look forward to your upcoming article, Professor Zenn, in the Journal of the Middle East and Africa. It will be out shortly, and we will read more about this topic in its written form. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We're so sorry we weren't able to get to everyone's questions. We will post this webinar on our website soon. Everyone, have a terrific day.